Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I think I would be more comfortable speaking about some of my own experiences as a diplomat rather than attempting as an amateur to address a distinguished body of historians, students and teachers. But I remember as a boy, in the depth of the Depression, being required to wear to school a pair of short pants which had been manufactured from a pair of knee breeches of my grandfather. I was indiscreet enough to boast about this to some of my friends at Launceston Grammar, and they became promptly dubbed Yak's parliamentary pants. And it is in this capacity, as one who has worn the trousers of the first Speaker of the Federal Parliament, that I speak to you tonight. In the early morning of the 23rd of July 1909, when the House of Representatives had been sitting continuously for 14 hours, its Speaker, Sir Frederick Holder of South Australia, collapsed on the floor of the House and died in his room close to the Speaker's chair a few hours later. Holder's dramatic death has been frequently recounted, more or less accurately, but much less has been written about his fruitful life. Yet he had a distinguished career in education, business, journalism, church life, and local government. He had been active in the federal movement and had been Treasurer and Premier of South Australia before he was elected to the House of Representatives. But for an accident of communications, which I shall describe, he would almost certainly have been a member of Barton's first cabinet. This paper is a preliminary study of that notable life and an attempt to assess where further research would be warranted to fill some gaps and clarify some puzzling incidents with a view to the production of a definitive biography. It is in part based on a seminar conducted in May of last year with the Australianist historians of the University of Tasmania, who kindly drew my attention to some points included tonight. And I hope tonight that I will have some points and some sources brought to my attention which will assist in the further development of this work. Frederick William Holder was born on the 12th of May 1850 at Happy Valley, South Australia, son of James Morcott Holder and his wife Martha. James Holder, a school teacher, had been born in 1824 at St. Bertolph without Aldersgate in London. His father and grandfather were freemen of the city as members of the Guild of Smiths. According to a family legend, one of them made a lock for the Bank of England. There is also a tradition that an earlier ancestor did the ironwork for St. Paul's Cathedral when it was rebuilt by Sir Christopher Wren. James himself was apprenticed as a grocer and admitted as a freeman on the 1st of May 1845. He married on the 9th of September 1848, and the young couple shortly afterwards sailed for Australia. James Holder was remembered by his granddaughter as a man with snow-white hair and beard and very black eyes, who used to do a lot of drawings. Before 1885, he had retired, living in Norwood and later in College Park. In those days, I think Norwood was not such a centre of controversy, football-wise and political-wise, as it is today. But he died in 1886 and Martha a year later. The young boy Frederick was at first taught by his father, then attended public schools. But James Holder was determined that his son should have a first-class education, and Frederick was sent to Adelaide to St. Peter's College. Like his father, Frederick Holder became a teacher and taught first at Prince Alfred College. But he had wide interests and was encouraged by Mr. later Sir William Soughton as a journalist to write articles for the Register. He taught for some years at Freeling, where James Holder was station master, and it was still as a teacher that Holder moved to the Borough, or Borough, where he found his vocation as journalist, civic leader, and parliamentarian. In August 1875, Holder took over the State School at Borough. It had formerly been run by a Cornishman from Bermuda, John Ricardo Stevens, who had gone to America to study homeopathic medicine and to spend some time in the United States during the centenary of the independence of the United States. Mrs. Stevens, formerly Miss Eliza Sims of Wiltshire, the teacher of the infant school, was maintaining her family during her husband's absence by running the fancy store attached to his chemist's shop. Among her wares were the materials the young teacher needed for his school. There and at Methodist church activities he met his future wife, Julia Stevens. The marriage of Frederick and Julia took place on the 29th of March 1877 in Dr. Stevens's home. Lady Holder recalled in later years that the wedding breakfast was in the back shed, which was long and suitable. The flags and flowers hid any defects, and there were blacksmiths named Kerr next door who struck an accompaniment on their anvils. On the 7th of October 1878, Holder's first child was born, a daughter, Ethel Roby, the future Mrs. A.H. Harry. My mother has left a vivid account of life of the Holder children in the borough in the 1880s. The borough had been a rich copper mining town, and you could still see cave-like hollows on the banks of the creek, where during the time when the mine was working, the miners lived with their families until enough houses were built. The discovery of the rich copper mines at Moonta and Wallaroo caused the closing of the borough mine, except for odd workers, but you could still find small lumps of copper ores in the old mine area. In mid-1878, Holder resigned his teaching job and took over the store from Dr. Stevens, who had bought a sheep station at Mongalata. He was appointed town clerk of the borough and later in the year became managing editor of the Borough Record. The circumstances of his resignation from the Education Department are not clear. The immediate occasion seems to have been a decision by the new Director of Education, Mr. John A. Hartley, who had been headmaster of Prince Alfred College, and I think was brought out from England to be headmaster of PAC. His decision that Holder should move to another school, but there is also evidence that he had views about education which were not approved by the authorities. In an editorial on the 12th of July 1878 in his newspaper, Holder inveighed against learning by rote and set examinations. He continued, "Not until the teachers of the colony are recognized as men and treated as such shall we have the results we ought to receive from the large funds liberally granted by Parliament." So at the age of 28, Holder turned to business, civic affairs, and journalism. The borough, for 32 years, had enjoyed varying degrees of prosperity, while copper prices continued at a high level. The mine had reached the zenith of its prosperity in 1860. From then on it went into a decline until, due to a tremendous inflow of water, it closed in 1877, just 2 years after Holder's arrival. In the Borough Corporation, the town clerk got practical experience, as we can judge from reports of meetings, when the agenda included, for example, the Eastern Road, the new bridge, and the road near the brewery and the school. Holder was later elected to the corporation and served 2 terms as mayor in 1885 and 1886. His period as mayor saw a number of improvements. He was largely responsible for a waterworks scheme, the erection of bridges, and the planting of trees. These and other amenities gave fresh life to the old mining town. Meanwhile, Holder was spreading his journalistic wings as editor of the local newspaper. Until about 1877, there was no newspaper in the borough, possibly because of discouragement by the South Australian Mining Association. But on the 5th of July 1878 appeared Volume 1, Number 1 of the Record, a paper for the borough and North East. The prologue, beginning, "The King is dead, long live the King," announced that the business part of the paper would be conducted by Mr. F.W. Holder as managing editor. All subject matter, however, would be approved by a committee of 3 to be elected quarterly by the 8 proprietors. For the next decade, through the columns of the Borough Record, Holder developed his ideas on the problems of South Australia. But it was clear from the outset that the Record would not confine itself to parish questions. The very first number carried a report of the Congress of Berlin, as well as an editorial on the water supply. 2 weeks later, the Record, which meant Holder, was commenting on upper house reform. In August, the future Treasurer was criticising proposals for a new income tax and proposing instead a graduated land tax. Holder had a house built in Kangaroo Street on the outskirts of the town. Here 4 more children were born in quick succession. A less pleasant event was a fire in premises next door which spread to the Record office and destroyed it. Fortunately, it was insured and rebuilt. Holder was in addition a captain in the volunteer forces. He was also twice president of the Borough Institute. Later, he was to be, in 1898, a member of the parliamentary committee which organised the Institute's Association of South Australia. In 1887, Holder stood for the State House of Assembly and was elected senior member for the borough. When the poll was declared, 6 of his supporters took the horse out of a 2-wheeled buggy or gig, decorated it with flowers and greenery, and drew him triumphantly through the streets, themselves pulling on the poles. I don't know what the present-day equivalent of that would be. So Holder moved to Adelaide. As a private member, he used to go to town on Monday evening's train and return on Friday night, leaving his wife to cope with the home and children. But before long, the Record was sold, and the house in Kangaroo Street was also sold, about 1893, to T. McBride, father, I think, of a future federal minister, Sir Philip McBride. And the Holder family moved to Glenelg, the seaside suburb of Adelaide. Adelaide was to be Sir Frederick's field of action for the next 14 years, during which he continued as member for the borough with large majorities until he entered the federal parliament in 1901. His political views at that time were summarised in the Parliamentary Register of 1887 as follows: free trade to the backbone, against selling Crown lands to remove the deficit, would borrow to pay it off and repay by general revenue in 10 or 12 years. Objects to property tax. Increase land tax to a penny in the pound, exempting prices paid to government. Reduce income tax deductions and customs duties, beginning with necessaries of life, favours payment of members, and mining private property. Opposes totalisator. Agrees with Chaffee's scheme, that is the irrigation scheme developed by the Chaffee brothers from Ontario in Canada. Holder didn't stay long in the back benches. Writing to his brother Sid on the 17th of January 1888, he said, "My first parliamentary session was one of the longest and most arduous we have ever had. I've taken a place among the rest, and have no fear but that I shall make headway." He did make headway. During that session, he was appointed a member of the Royal Commission on the Land Act, on the land laws, a subject in which he was thoroughly at home. In 1888, he was a member of the Select Committee on the Star of Greece shipwreck disaster and chairman of the Barrier Trade Select Committee. He gave his brother at this time a pen picture of the economic situation as he saw it. "A brighter day seems to be dawning for this colony, and all our industries are looking up. Though we've just adopted a mischievous policy of protection, our mining interests were never before so promising, and we have rubies too by the ton, it seems. The Broken Hill and neighbouring silver mines are simply wonderful. That mine alone, discovered 3 years ago and shares 2.5 years ago worth £9, has now yielded over 3 million ounces of silver, and the shares are now worth over £350, including offshoots." Dr. later Sir John Cockburn, who had been elected as member for the borough in 1884 and had been a member of Sir John Downer's government as Minister for Education, was defeated in the election of 1887 by 5 votes, but in April was elected again in Mount Barker. On 27th of June 1889, he was invited to form a ministry and asked Holder to join it as treasurer. Holder was quick to master the intricacies of state finance. He worked hard and soon had a firm grip on his department. His first budget speech was not only concise and lucid, but even eloquent. He quickly touched on the various complicated questions, delivering his address with few notes. The Cockburn ministry passed some advanced measures, including acts providing for succession duties and a progressive tax on unimproved land values, something Holder had advocated years before. On the 19th of August 1890, when the Cockburn ministry was succeeded by Playford, Holder had established his reputation as a treasurer, and he was to submit 9 budgets in the next 11 years. His speeches constitute a summary of the economic history of South Australia in the decade before Federation. On the 25th of June 1890, as treasurer, Holder was appointed chairman of a select committee to inquire into the probable result of intercolonial free trade on South Australia. On the 9th of July, he moved that the Assembly call for the appointment of a Royal Commission, including the members of the Select Committee, to carry on its work. The Commission was appointed, with Holder as chairman. The proceedings of the Commission and its report show Holder a free trader interested in the practical benefits of federation for South Australia. Occasionally reading it, I felt that he was a little embarrassed by the necessity for giving consideration to the wine industry, an industry of which he heartily disapproved. Nonetheless, the witnesses were given a courteous hearing. The final paragraphs of the report, drafted, I think, by Holder, dated the 23rd of December 1890, read as follows. Your commissioners are firmly convinced that the welfare of Australia will be promoted by the abandonment of all restrictions upon intercolonial trade. By adopting such a policy, the one object will be throughout Australia to render industry productive, by leaving it to follow natural channels of employment, and by affording every facility to commerce to early realize rapid progress in wealth and prosperity, by developing in each colony the industry for which nature has best fitted it without wasteful rivalry. The conclusions which your commissioners have formed upon the subject of their investigation are as follows. This was 1890. We recommend the adoption of intercolonial free trade on the basis of a uniform tariff and regard it as the corollary of federation of the Australian colonies. We recognize the many difficulties which have to be overcome before federation can be accomplished, and are of the opinion that in the meantime practically the whole of existing reasons for postponement will have passed away. The benefits arising from intercolonial free trade will far outweigh any disadvantages which may result. One of Holder's first interests as a member of the South Australian House of Assembly was as a member of that Royal Commission on the Land Laws. After the fall of the Cockburn Ministry in August 1890, particularly as leader of the opposition in 1891, Holder did a great deal of travelling and wrote a series of articles for the South Australian Register, which were published in a small booklet entitled Our Pastoral Industry. He stressed that the agricultural and pastoral industries lay at the root of national prosperity. Grain, flour and wool constituted 9/10 of total exports. He advocated what he regarded as the natural order of development of land, first pastoral occupation in large areas, then mining where minerals existed, then the gradual subdivision and development of the capacity of the land for higher utilization. Big farmers should disappear with subdivision, and this would advance the prosperity of the colony. But the process could not safely be hastened. The pastoral industry should be maintained in pastoral country. Holder estimated that the 318,000 square miles of South Australia outside the counties could carry at least 30 sheep to the square mile, nearly 10 million sheep compared with the then 3.5 million. I believe there are now over 20 million sheep in South Australia in an area of 380,000 square miles. To develop the country would, he reckoned, cost £5 million. One great obstacle to progress was the absence of natural waters, and the cost consequently involved in providing the necessary supply to develop the country. The other problem was the presence of vermin, by which he meant wild dogs and rabbits. In the southeast, in the northeast, in the north and in the west, terrible losses had resulted from their ravages. Holder argued that close settlement, which kept vermin in check, could not solve the problem in the pastoral area. Here, one plan alone would enable the difficulty to be overcome: subdivision of the country by means of vermin-proof fences, so that the matter could be dealt with in detail. On the 16th of June 1892, Holder, as leader of the opposition, moved an amendment to the address in reply to express want of confidence in His Excellency's advisers. The motion was carried. Playford resigned, and Holder, at 42, formed his first ministry as Premier and Treasurer. The youngest Premier, I think, until the record was broken by Don Dunstan. But it was a time of great financial difficulty, and the government was defeated in October of the same year. Acts were, however, passed in 1892 to establish a national park and to incorporate the School of Mines and Industries of South Australia. After Holder's death, the then president of the council of the school, Sir Langdon Bonython, recalled Holder's undertaking when Premier to provide £10,000 as the first instalment of a building grant for premises for the school. Sir Langdon said Holder's decision was arrived at when the finances of the state were not in a flourishing condition. The best possible evidence of the genuine interest which he felt in education. He became a member of the council in 1902 and was acting president in 1907. Sir Langdon described Holder as an enthusiastic educationalist who began life as a school teacher and never lost his attachment to the teacher's work. He believed, I quote Sir Langdon here, he believed in equality of opportunity, but without a comprehensive and an effective system of education, this, in his opinion, was an impossibility. Meanwhile, the economic depression continued through 1892 and into 1893, with several banks suspending payments. a strike at Broken Hill, a small harvest, and low prices for staple products. Downer succeeded Holder as Premier, but again it was a short-lived government. At the election of April 1893, Downer's Treasurer and Commissioner of Public Works were both defeated. The newly organised Labour Party won 10 seats. When the address in reply was moved at the commencement of the 14th Parliament, Holder, as leader of the opposition, indicated that he did not propose to talk on the policy enunciated in the Governor's speech, as the results of the election were an indictment of the government. And in a peculiar move, Kingston then moved the adjournment of the House. The Labour members supported the motion, which was carried by a majority of 2. Now, this procedure, though unusual, amounted to a vote of want of confidence, and Downer resigned. And although Holder was leader of the opposition, the Governor called on Kingston to form a government. According to Responsible Government in South Australia, the reasons for the acceptance of Kingston as leader were his good relations with the unions and his ability to unite all sections of the Liberal Party. But it would be very interesting to know more of the circumstances in which that manoeuvre was developed. In any event, Holder was included in Kingston's cabinet as Commissioner of Public Works, and when Playford became Agent General for South Australia in London in April 1894, Holder became Treasurer and Minister controlling the Northern Territory, then of course part of South Australia. As Treasurer in the Kingston Cabinets, 1893 to 1899, Holder, despite successive years of drought and depression, managed the finances well and made some useful innovations in the Treasury Department. To Holder's initiation were due many of the reforms passed by the Kingston government. For example, the Act to constitute the State Bank of South Australia, and he sponsored progressive death duties, land tax, and eventually income tax. In successive years, he presented straightforward budgets, aiming always at a balanced budget. Holder was in this period an advocate of bimetallism, a subject on which he spoke personally even while he was Treasurer, but otherwise his financial policies were highly orthodox. Holder enjoyed, in particular, his responsibilities as Minister controlling the Northern Territory. His articles on the pastoral industry revealed an early and keen interest in northern problems. He describes in those articles the artesian mounds of the far north and the thousands of skeletons of cattle which had perished there. In later years, he used to deliver lectures about a journey he made as one of the commissioners of the South Australian government to report the best means of promoting settlement in the far north. From Adelaide, they had a 686 miles train journey, taking 3 days, to the northern terminus, thence on camels with Afghan drivers. For whole days they would travel over unbroken sandhills. When approaching the MacDonnell Ranges, it seemed as though they were riding up to a great barrier of rock, but there was a natural cut about 12 feet wide. After passing through, they continued the journey to a cattle station. There came a downpour of rain, 4.5 inches in 36 hours. When they were coming back, they found that the sandhills were covered with a luxuriant plant. They met with only a few aborigines, but near the MacDonnell Ranges saw some splendid specimens of humanity. Time doesn't permit dipping further into Sir Frederick's travel lectures, though they make fascinating reading. On the 28th of November 1899, the Kingston government was defeated in a complicated manoeuvre to avoid rejection of the household suffrage bill by the Legislative Council. Kingston advised dissolution, but Lord Tennyson invited Burgoyne, and when he declined, V.L. Solomon to form who formed an ephemeral ministry literally one day on the 5th of December. This time, Kingston stood aside It was Holder, as leader of the opposition, who brought down Solomon's government, and Holder became Premier and Treasurer, posts which he held until he moved to the Federal Parliament in May of 1901. The second Holder government established free libraries in corporate towns and district councils, legislated for standard time throughout South Australia. Loans were raised for waterworks, including completion of the Bundalia and Barossa schemes. But it is time to turn to Holder's contribution to the federal movement. I've mentioned his interest in intercolonial free trade in 1890. He was not in the South Australian delegation to the 1891 convention headed by Playford. The delegation did, however, include Kingston, even though, according to Deakin, Kingston had not yet attained to the federal spirit. Holder's attitude to federation, as he stated it a little later, was that he was not in favour of federation at all hazards and at any price, but that it was coming, and it was important to see that they had a form of constitution which would be the best possible. In the Federal Convention elections in 1897, as the election for the delegation to the Federal Convention, Holder was second to Kingston in South Australia, though Baker, Downer, Coburn and Gordon had all served previously in 1891. Deakin, in the Federal Story, says Holder was decidedly the strongest addition to this team. He described him as having a singularly lucid mind and faculty for logical exposition, great mastery of detail and cautious judgment, which influenced his hearers more and more as they came to realize his thoroughness and fairness in debate. At the beginning of the convention in Adelaide, which was marked by intrigues by and against Kingston, who was eventually made the president, while Barton was the leader for the convention, Holder does not appear to have participated. He had not as yet found his feet, but by September 1897, again according to Deakin, he had shaken off his former Confederate ideals and had become a warm Federalist, who had come to rank with Turner as the financial advisor by whom all was swayed. At the close of the convention, Holder was included in Deakin's list of 9 in the first rank of men of influence. At the convention, Holder's main attention was directed to financial questions, though he spoke also on other matters, not always, I would say now, with great judgment. For example, he suggested that the internal postal system should be left in local hands. His copy of the draft constitution is unmarked until we come to chapter 4, when there are plentiful marginal notes approving the draft for consolidated revenue fund, expenses of collection and money to be appropriated by law. Opposite clause 7, dealing with uniform duties of customs, Holder queried, "Is it wise to retain the interim power? Should states have power to change after handing over control to the federal parliament?" A good deal of research is warranted, I think, in assessing the part played by Holder in the convention. I cannot, however, refrain from quoting one more of his penciled notations without comment. In clause 8, trade and intercourse throughout the Commonwealth, whether by means of internal carriage or ocean navigation, shall be absolutely free. The word absolutely is heavily underscored, and in the margin is the comment, "requires revision." That clause has, of course, provoked endless study and comment by lawyers and historians. In the absence of Kingston, it fell to Holder's lot to present the product of the Adelaide session to the South Australian Parliament, which he did in a speech full of sober estimates of the effects of the coming federation, the powers of the Senate in relation to money bills, the cost of federal services, which he calculated at the extremely modest initial figure of £300,000 for new services and the conversion of public debts. He arrived at this figure of £300,000 by an interesting process of reasoning. By calculating the cost of existing state services and deducting this from the total cost of government, and he reached the conclusion that the only real new costs for the Federation would be for the Governor-General and for the Federal Parliament and for the new Secretariat serving the new Prime Minister. He argued to the Parliament that the proposed constitution would enable the states to exercise powers, would enable the people to exercise powers which the local parliaments would have no power to exercise. The powers of the people would be increased rather than diminished by the establishment of federation. But the greatest advantage was absolute freedom of trade. After the further revision in Sydney and Melbourne and the adoption of the bill, it was submitted to the electors in New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia and Tasmania. Holder was indefatigable in securing its acceptance. He was invited to visit almost every part of the province to explain its provisions and was in the habit of delivering 7 and 8 addresses a week in different districts. He was largely responsible, it has been suggested, for the preponderating vote in South Australia in favour of the bill. Actually, in the referendum of 1898, only 39% of eligible electors voted, and the bill was carried by a majority of only 2 to 1, compared with 5 to 1 in Victoria and Tasmania. But it seems that the comparatively small vote may be attributed to the fact that when the vote was taken, the failure in New South Wales was already known. At the referendum on the amended Commonwealth Bill on 29th of April 1899, the bill was carried by 65,900 ayes to 17,000 noes. R. Norris, whom I should like to meet, in his Economic Influences on the 1898 South Australian Federation referendum, notes that Holder, the campaigner par excellence, whose role was acknowledged to have been decisive, was both treasurer and Wesleyan lay preacher, so that he possessed a dual aura. In his extensive tours, according to Norris, he brought the gospel of federation at no cost. He prophesied financial damnation for the depressed and sparsely populated colony should she fail to gain her salvation by entering into the Kingdom of Australia. The opposition lamented that Holder's statements are taken for the gospel truth because of his Christian profession. Well, after the Australian Constitution had been approved by referendum by the people of the 5 colonies, West Australia still hesitating, it was necessary, in accordance with the constitutional theory of that period, for it to be incorporated in an Act of the Imperial Parliament at Westminster. And the question of who should be the emissaries to London to superintend the passage of the bill is an interesting question in itself. But after lengthy consideration, the following were chosen to represent the colonies: Barton for New South Wales, Deakin for Victoria, Kingston for South Australia, Dixon for Queensland and Fish for Tasmania. In responsible government in South Australia, it is stated that the delegation from the federating colonies included the Premier of South Australia, the Honourable C.C. Kingston, but this was already March 1900, by which time Sir Frederick Holder was the Premier. He did not go to London. That was Kingston's work. There the British government wanted to curtail the powers conferred on the Federation. And with Kingston in London and Holder back in Adelaide, some interesting exchanges took place. Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, Secretary of State, yes, objected in particular to the abolition of the right of appeal from the decisions of the High Court upon constitutional questions. When Chamberlain found that he could make no impression on Barton, Deakin and Kingston, he cabled to the state premiers. and a Premier's Conference was hurriedly held in Melbourne. Maclean, Holder and Lyne sufficiently influenced Philp and Lewis to prepare a draft answer to Chamberlain, which was cabled to London. Barton, Kingston and Deakin thereupon revised it. Holder and the other premiers did not, however, approve their far-reaching proposals. Kingston cabled Holder, who replied to the effect that nothing more could be done unanimously. Well, eventually a formula was found which seemed suitable to Barton, Deakin and Kingston, but was attacked in Australia. The South Australian government, amid stormy denunciatory cables from Kingston, withdrew its approval and declared for the original bill as proposed by the colonies. Deakin comments that Holder wavered too under pressure, but fell back upon the bill. The Constitution was finally accepted and enacted by the British Parliament, but the Commonwealth was not to come into existence until the 1st of January 1901. Meanwhile, a provisional government had to be constituted. Holder hoped to be the first Treasurer under Barton, who was generally expected to be the first Prime Minister. The election for the first Parliament was not to take place until the 30th of March 1901. When the first Governor-General, Lord Hopetoun, arrived in Sydney on the 15th of December 1900, as you'll recall, he commissioned Sir William Lyne to form a government, apparently on the ground that he was Premier of the Mother State. Lyne invited Barton to accept the portfolio, but Barton refused and urged his friends, Deakin and Kingston, to do the same. Lyne asked his fellow premiers to come to Sydney for consultation. Deakin secured a promise from Turner to use his influence with Holder to persuade Lyne to vacate. No doubt Kingston also spoke to Holder before he left Adelaide on the 20th of December, on the long train journey to Sydney. According to Sir Robert Garran in Prosper the Commonwealth, Deakin and Turner met the train at North Melbourne on the 21st of December, and Holder and Turner took the evening express to Sydney, having been worked on by Deakin. On the 21st of December, Deakin was saying gloomily that Lyne would form a ministry and could have Turner and Isaacs for the asking, and Holder also. No record is available of the encounter between the premiers and Lyne, but it is clear that when Holder, Philp and Turner saw Lyne on the 22nd of December, they refused to join his ministry. According to the Honourable J.V. O'Loughlin, Holder, when, after some cogitation, he declined Lyne's offer, suggested Mr. Gordon as the South Australian representative for the Cabinet. But when Turner and Holder returned to Melbourne on Sunday the 23rd of December, they made a diplomatic statement. They said their advice to Sir William Lyne was that the first federal cabinet should be one that was stable and strong. Their advice had been sought and had been given, and they did not know if Sir William Lyne would act upon it or not, but they could say that neither of them was prepared to join a federal ministry with Sir William Lyne at its head. So Holder refused this invitation to a first cabinet. Barton had indicated to Holder that he could expect an important post in the first federal government, and Holder had hoped to be Treasurer, but this did not work out. Apparently what happened was that when Lyne abandoned his attempt and called on Barton on Christmas Eve 1900, Barton sent telegrams to his fellow premiers inviting them to join his ministry. He received, having had this dramatic interview with Lyne, having returned to Melbourne, having there explained to Deakin what had happened, having returned to Adelaide, and on Christmas Eve he was probably on the beach at Glenelg with his family. I'd like to get evidence of where he was that day. In any event, Barton didn't wait long for an answer. He was glad enough, no doubt, to have an excuse to turn to Kingston, his colleague in the federal movement since 1891 and fellow battler against Chamberlain in London. He informed Holder, possibly through Kingston, that he would use his influence to have Holder elected as first Speaker. Holder was unhappy, but accepted the consolation. Even in a brief sketch like this, no assessment of Holder's contribution to South Australia as he moved to the federal arena would be complete without reference to his work for the Methodist Church and associated social and philanthropic causes. He joined the Methodist Church in the borough, and following in the footsteps of his father-in-law, Dr. Stevens, became a lay preacher. He preached regularly whenever his parliamentary duties permitted. Some of his sermons were published after his death and reveal a Christian with a fundamentalist faith, but who believed in the practical application of Christian ethics. To an objector who once claimed that politics and religion do not mix, he replied, "Then so much the worse for politics. Any view of politics that would not allow of the admixture must be false." In West Adelaide, where he had occupied the pulpit the weekend before his death, a new church was dedicated, Holder Memorial, on the 25th of July 1914. Holder was also active in church administration and the movement for the unification of the Methodist Church. He also gave active support to the temperance cause, in which his wife, Lady Holder, was a world leader. These interests he maintained after he entered the federal parliament. First, however, a brief note on the election in South Australia for members of the Senate and House of Representatives of the newly established Commonwealth of Australia. This took place on Saturday the 30th of March 1901. As South Australia had not yet been divided into federal constituencies, the election for the House of Representatives was held on a statewide basis in the same way as for the Senate. There were 17 candidates for the 7 seats, including Kingston, who had been given the portfolio of Minister for Trade and Customs, and Holder, until the election, Premier and Treasurer. The campaign was opened by Edmund Barton as Prime Minister in the Adelaide Town Hall, and Martindale, who wrote an analysis of the election, said that Barton had on that occasion one of the finest audiences ever seen in South Australia. Martindale also noted that the voting had been very heavy, much heavier than at the election of the Australian National Convention or at the 2 federal referendums. Yet of the 154,000 persons on the roll, which included women, of course, since the election was conducted under South Australian electoral law, only 62,000 or 40% voted. For the House of Representatives, Kingston led the poll, followed by Sir Langdon Bonython, and third was McMahon Glynn, and fourth Holder. Holder was disappointed at this result. He noted on his copy of the analysis that if the 6 Adelaide districts were excluded, he had received the largest number of votes in the 21 country districts. At the declaration of the poll, Holder declared that the greatest honour which had previously been done him was when they elected him a member of that body which had framed the machinery which the federal parliament was now about to start working. Knowing that the government would propose him as Speaker, Holder kept himself aloof from party issues during the campaign and was thus free of party entanglements. And in due course, Barton suggested to the Leader of the Opposition, Sir George Reid, that in accordance with British parliamentary custom, Holder be elected without opposition as Speaker. According to Mr. Norman Macon, there was an unofficial gathering of members of the House of Representatives to discuss the appointment of Speaker. But when the House assembled in the Victorian Parliament building, a motion by Mr. MacDonald Patterson for Brisbane, MP for Brisbane, proposed Holder, and he was elected unanimously. There were only There was only one sour note. Mr. Bruce Smith MP complained of a letter that had circulated among members concerning the election of the Speaker, which he regarded as canvassing for support. Mr. Macon, in an unpublished essay on Holder, comments, "It is evident that earlier Mr. Bruce Smith had designs on the position." Another member who indicated some dissatisfaction was Mr. Cameron MP from Tasmania, but this was for quite a different reason. He said, "I regret that a free trader has been voted into the office of Speaker. I feel that it would have been far better had Mr. Holder remained on the floor of the House." It was no light responsibility to organise the work of the new Parliament, and it would be interesting to know how many of the decisions were made by Holder personally. Members came from 6 states with different modes of procedure. It was a happy circumstance that Holder's opposite number, the first President of the Senate, was Sir Richard Chaffey Baker, also from South Australia. Baker had been President of the Legislative Council of South Australia from 1893 to 1900 and had prepared and published early in 1891 a manual of reference to authorities for the use of the members of the Convention. He was a member of the Constitutional Committee and chairman of committees of the Convention of 1897. Baker told Lady Holder later that the 2 presiding officers had many novel and difficult questions to decide, which owing to Sir Frederick's ability and courtesy were always settled amicably, and a lasting friendship established between the 2 houses, at least for a few years. In determining the procedures to recommend for the use of the new Parliament, Holder and Baker no doubt drew heavily on British practice, as followed in South Australia. In an article for Life in 1904, Holder mentions in particular not only May's parliamentary practice, but also Blackmore's handbook. Blackmore, clerk of the South Australian Assembly, I think, had been secretary to the 1897 Convention and clearly influenced Holder on many issues. In this article, which is a classic statement of the role and feelings of a speaker, Holder referred to an almost overwhelming desire to step out of the chair and tear off the gag so that he might share in the debate. And the conclusion of that article was the honour and dignity of the office and the responsibility of it make its occupancy no sinecure, and the necessary withdrawal from active participation in debate is no small act of self-denial. But Holder was elected unopposed at succeeding elections and unanimously as Speaker. In the 1906 election, the Australasian National League and the Farmers and Producers Political Union supported Holder, though he was standing, as was his practice, as an independent. He told Deakin that they had used him to beat the Labour man and that he had used them to win the seat. Holder added, again indicating that even after 5 years he still regretted his departure from active politics, that he did not like being Speaker and would follow Deakin on the floor of the House. There are other mysteries and problems still to be resolved, including the circumstances of the death of Sir Frederick Holder. The encyclopedias and the brief articles which have been written almost without exception attribute his death to the stress of dealing with intemperate debates and the stormy scene in the Parliament in the early hours of that morning of the 22nd of July 1909. But there is considerable evidence that Sir Frederick had in fact, with frail health, been covering up a condition of ill health for some time, and that possibly this aspect of the drama of his death was exaggerated for political purposes. That, I think, must await a fuller account of his life. If I may conclude, I would conclude only with 3 quotes from people who knew him well. First, from the Honourable Alexander Poynton. Sir Frederick Holder, renowned as a Speaker of the House of Representatives, possessed unapproached ability as a speechmaker and could be copied with advantage by many politicians of today. By Sir William Sowden, Sir Frederick Holder stands out in my memory as one of the smartest administrators ever known in Australian politics. In the absence of a ministerial colleague, he would, in a few hours, deal with a heap of unsigned documents which had remained uncompleted for weeks or months. Deacon gave his judgment. Inspired by a lofty conception of the duties of his office, he presided over the House of Representatives with conspicuous ability, firmness and impartiality. An unsparing devotion to administrative duties was associated with a personal courtesy which endeared him to members and officers of the House. Among those administrative duties was the chairmanship of the Library Committee, and he played a great part in the establishment of the Parliamentary Library of the Commonwealth, which eventually developed into the great National Library, so that in Canberra, where there is a suburb named for Sir Frederick, perhaps the finest monument is the National Library building, the library, the greatest educator of all. Sir Frederick was made a knight of the Order of St. Michael and St. George in 1902. The citation doesn't specify basis specifically for his public service, but it does refer to him as the Speaker of the Parliament. I think that this was the basis for his knighthood. There are some officers of state which carry an almost automatic knighthood. This was the beginning of the Commonwealth. There were no precedents, but it was evidently thought that it warranted it.
Interesting, the question, Mr. Harry, of Holder's relationship to Kingston. How did they get on? Where did they differ? And related to that, how did Holder get on with the late new Virgin Labour movement in politics? Did that contribute perhaps to that disappointing result, as you suggest, in the first federal election in 1951, where Holder came in fourth, rather to surprise, and was forced to look at that distinction between the city electorate and the country electorate?
Well, it is an interesting relationship between Kingston and Holder. Kingston was an extrovert, a man who was a manipulator of men, and Holder was a scholar, a lover of books. In his own family life, he had his own library, and in the Parliament, in those long hours when he would sit in the Speaker's chamber, he devoted himself to reading. It was commented on that he didn't come out to sit on the benches, watch the proceedings, as some speakers have done, but he himself said that he preferred to wait for people to come and join him in the Speaker's room for a chat. This is typical, I think, of the man. But as far as I can gather, these events, the changes of government, were by arrangement. It was not just accidental. It was agreed between Holder and Kingston that Holder would decline to comment on the address and reply, and that Kingston would then move the adjournment, which was the motion that he used. And my conclusion is that Holder was happy to be treasurer under Kingston and accepted his political leadership. He liked dealing with the economic problems, with the legislation, with the institutions. He was prepared to leave the politics to Kingston. It meant in the end that he became a speaker instead of being in the cabinet. Again, I would say that it was a role which was suited to his temperament. But I can find no sense of a clash between Holder and Kingston until it came to the choice of the cabinet. And here I have found in our family records an indication that he was disappointed, extremely disappointed, and the family was disappointed. But again, it was not attributed to any skullduggery by Kingston. There was a suggestion that Barton had told Kingston that there would be two positions for South Australia, one in the cabinet and the speakership, and that he and Holder could work it out between them, and that Kingston had then gone to Holder and said, Barton wants me in the cabinet and he'll make me speaker. But that story is expressly denied by someone who ought to know the circumstances. As far as I can make out, there is no truth in that particular furphy.
Mr. Harry, I wonder whether you have any evidence of Holder as a person who's greatly interested in mining activity. You mentioned, of course, his associations with the town of Thurrock and with the School of Mines, and you mentioned in connection with the School of Mines his interest in education rather than in mining. Knowing the interest of Kingston and the Spoker and many others in the frantic mining activity of the 1890s, I wonder perhaps whether Sir Frederick Holder himself might have been involved or interested in that.
This is something that I've not investigated in depth. I have a son who now works for CRA and who's been trying to persuade me to study the mining side more. I believe that Holder held some PhD, not some Broken Hill shares, but I've no indication that he was himself involved in mining enterprises, financially or otherwise. Possible. One of the mysteries of Holder is that there are so few personal papers. What I have gathered, I've gathered together with the help of my cousin, Alison Holder, from my cousin in England, and from other members of the family, but it's a pitifully small amount of papers. Most of what I've given you is from the public record, although there were memoirs written by Lady Holder and by Holder's daughter, and another that filled up the origin side. I have a lot more of that material, but nothing about his interest in mining. So, yes, there are a few references, but not in particular, simply statements that he had supported the women's suffrage movement. And I have traced that the history of women's suffrage, and so far I haven't found any very active, much activity by Holder, but I feel that he was, and that there is material on that. I can't document it. There's plenty of evidence of his church work, his work against for temperance, against totalizators, this sort of work, but positive work for women's suffrage I've not found. I'll keep looking.
Any further questions? Just on the question of payment amendments, I think the holder entered Parliament in the year that members, well, the Act was passed to pay members of the South Australian Legislature. Do you know why he supported that? Apart from the fact that he probably needed the money, but what were his motives behind supporting payment amendments?
Yeah, I have just a bare statement that he was in favour of it. He had, of course, been a public servant as a teacher. He was not in any sense a wealthy man. His net estate when he died was only £6,000. That, of course, would be the equivalent of perhaps $200,000 today, but not a fortune.
Well, that's our usual custom tonight, and propose a vote of thanks to Mr. Harris in the chair. I think we've all been very interested in what he's had to say about it. I certainly hope that you'll go on and write biography that he's been thinking of writing and been doing some work on in recent months. One legacy of Sir Frederick's, I suppose, one aspect of his career which he was not very successful in trying to promote total abstinence from alcoholic drinks. And but there was one place where, at least the spirit, if I can use that word, what it was about, it had some abiding impact, and that was in Parliament House itself. Mr. Frank Green, a historian I used to know well in my university days, who was clerk of the Federal House of Representatives for many years, and held his towel, especially when Parliament first moved to Canberra. Quite a few years, the only alcoholic beverage you could buy in the parliamentary bar was stone green ginger wine, which was used as a mixer. And that was the nearest, I suppose, that Australia has ever got to that kind of temperance having an impact on public life. That's sheer speculation, of course. Mr. Harry, thank you very much for a most interesting address. And we hope that you'll and your wife will be able to enjoy something of our festival while you're doing that.